Welcome to Models, Games, Dioramas, and Things. What can you imagine today? Models, Games, Dioramas, and Things is a place where we show techniques and alternatives that are utilized for detailing models, dioramas, vignettes, game terrain, and more. We share practical and alternative solutions for makers and artists. Come join us in the journey. What can you imagine today? If you're new to this channel, welcome. We hope you enjoy what you see and get a little information to help you on your journey. What can you imagine today? There are no promotions, sponsorships, or compensation associated with any product, brand, or seller that I may display, demonstrate, or mention in this video. Like, comment, subscribe, and share. Thank you. With that out of the way, let's get to it. I got back into model railroading, more having to do with nostalgia than with model railroading itself. My dad passed away in 2020. You see, my dad and I, when I was about 6 years old, had a model railroad. Actually, it was more his than ours. Be that as it may, my father is gone now, and some of the greatest times we had together, my dad built his basement-sized model railroad empire using leftover construction lumber. By the time I was a teenager, I had my own model railroad. And having this model railroad is my way of remembering him and the good times we shared. I learned a lot from my dad. I wish I'd have listened as well as I heard. It just so happens that when my dad and I were working on our layout, I had modeled in Engage, 1/160th scale, or 1/150th scale for those of you across the pond. So, thinking about those days and considering the space I had, I decided to model this working diorama in Engage. When building a model railroad, a good plywood bench provides a solid foundation for it. There are many ways to support your model railroad, and they all fall under the general heading of benchwork. Benchwork can be just about anything. The materials and techniques are not important if your benchwork gets the job done. For your first benchwork project, you may want to try a small plywood table. This will get your trains off of the floor or dining table and give you a place to add buildings and scenery to your model. The consensus among model railroaders is that the ideal height for a model railroad is somewhere between 42 and 52 inches. There's no right or wrong answer as to the ideal height for a model railroad. It is a subjective decision, and it's going to depend on your needs, preferences, and who will be operating and viewing the layout. You will also need to consider any restrictions you may have in terms of space. After determining the size of my model railroad, I then moved forward to what the story of my model railroad would be. I wanted it to be unique. It seemed everyone in model railroading is building something around the early age of diesel engines and where steam engines could still be seen. These model railroad eras range from about 1900 to about 1960. There are a few outliers that build modern era model railroads. However, I wanted to be different. I wanted to try to build an era of railroading when it was new. The steam railway engine had just been invented. Richard Trevithick in England was the first to use a steam carriage on a railroad. In 1803, he built a steam locomotive that in February of 1804 made a successful run on a horse car route in Wales. The adaptation of the steam engine to railways became a commercial success with the rocket of English engineer George Stephenson in 1829. The time span of my model railroad begins about 10 or 15 years before the American Civil War, say about from 1850 to 1899. Even if my rivet counting isn't spot on in terms of what engines are being used and the like, well, let me borrow a cliche if I may. It's my railroad. Here's a synopsis of what my model railroad will look like and be about. The modern-day site of Colorado Springs, Colorado, was called Old Colorado City. It was part of the American frontier. The town of Colorado Springs was founded by General William Palmer as a resort town. Old Colorado City, built in 1859 during the Pikes Peak Gold Rush, was the Colorado Territory capital. The city had an estimated population just over 5,000 in 1879. Colorado Springs grew by 164% when more than 11,000 people settled in the town between 1880 and 1890. Old Colorado City was annexed into Colorado Springs. Railroads brought tourists and visitors to the area from other parts of the United States and abroad. The city was noted for junctions of 7 railways: the Durango and Silverton Railroad in 1868, the Denver and Rio Grande in 1870, the Denver and New Orleans Manitou branch in 1882, the Colorado Midland Railroad in 1885, Colorado Springs and Interurban in 1887, it was a horse and electric tram, and the Atchison, Topeka, and the Santa Fe in 1889. Rock Island Railroad in 1889, as well as Colorado Springs and Cripple Creek Railways in 1900. Old Colorado City was also known for mining exchanges, and brokers for the Cripple Creek Gold Rush. There's a town in Colorado called Cripple Creek. That's how I got the name for my model railroad, Cripple Creek Run Railroad. The first aspect of building a unique model railroad has to do with my physical condition more than other ideas about how benchwork should be built for a model railroad. For me, I wanted to be able to sit in my wheelchair at the layout and operate from the perspective of eye level or near eye level. The other consideration for me was that I needed to be able to remain in my wheelchair while all of it was constructed. As a result, there are extra build sequences that most people do not have to consider. The amount of space in my apartment is quite limited. Were it not for the fact that I turned my living room and dining room into a model building shop, there would not have a place to set up anything. As it is, my layout is somewhat smaller than a door, which truly limited me to a small layout. The size I ended up building was 30 inches by 60 inches, or 760 to 1525 millimeters. The top set at about 45 inches, or 1140 millimeters from the floor. Because of certain elements that would become evident, I had to be a little creative. This involved building 2 frames, one slightly larger than the other. I built the first frame sized for the model railroad. The second frame just small enough to fit inside the first. I divided their lengths into thirds for cross-member support. Well, almost. I needed to offset these cross members so that they would not interfere or impede with the wire runs that would ultimately occur. Most are familiar with the adage, measure twice, cut once. Well, I prepared plans, measured numerous times, and I still cut it wrong. I own a hammer and saw, but I don't call myself a carpenter. I know just enough how to use them without hurting myself. Too little knowledge could be a dangerous thing. The materials used for the top frame were a 1x8 and a 1x4 with 1x3 cross members. I used 1/4 inch plywood for the top. This is not what I would recommend. However, at the time of construction, lumber prices soared. A little bug got into the world and shut it all down. The other reason is that I wanted to use the offcuts for a background backdrop. The materials used for the lower and second frame were 1x4s and 1x3s for the cross members. Remember, I was talking about making the frames one a little smaller than the other so that they could slide past one another? Well, I made two errors. The first was cutting boards too short. The second was more like a Bob Ross incident, a happy accident. I then moved forward, and you guessed it, I didn't put them together correctly. Remember I talked about that happy accident? Well, if it were not for that happy accident, I would be buying lumber and starting all over. I intended that the front edge to cover the edges of the side panels, as viewed from the front. I assembled them the other way around. Now I have sawn edges exposed on the front. On the other hand, if I didn't make that happy accident, the frames would not fit together. The frames fit together left to right now well, but their offset is a little bit too much in the back by about 1.5 inches or 38 millimeters. I had to do a little creative construction to get what I needed accomplished, that being the hinges to fit and work correctly. After the frames were built, I prepared the legs and cross members to provide longitudinal and lateral support. I used 2x3s for the legs. This allowed me to use leveling feet to help level the table. The cross members for the legs were made of so-called doorstop molding. This is the material that is usually used for making door frames. It's the piece that the door slams against when one allows it to slam shut. Most, if any, model railroaders don't have a couple of features that my Benchwork has. The first feature is a pull-out drawer console. Having this, two things happened. One, I needed to adjust where the cross bracing was placed. And two, having the console drawer allowed me to operate the model railroad in a remote-like manner. The second feature is probably the most unique. As I mentioned before, is that the layout can be lifted so that work may be performed on the necessary wiring and features that this operating diorama will have without having to leave my chair. Getting on the floor is quite troublesome. Not so much the getting down, it's the getting back up.